In 1979, most Americans did not feel like they were living through the beginning of a collapse. They felt like they were living through another rough patch, another annoying year, another round of price jumps that everybody complained about at the kitchen table and then moved on from, because the country had been through worse and bounced back before. If you were alive then, the world still looked sturdy on the outside. People still had jobs. Paychecks still came on Fridays. Big companies still felt permanent. The factory down the road wasn't a former plant. It was just the plant. Pensions were still a normal sentence to say out loud without irony. A mortgage was something you could picture, not a fantasy reserved for the lucky. The news was loud, but the fundamentals of daily life still felt like they held, and that's the trick. When something truly structural starts to shift, it rarely announces itself with one clean headline. It doesn't show up as a villain twirling a mustache. It shows up as a few temporary fixes that become permanent habits. It shows up as the price of money quietly changing. It shows up as incentives rewiring while people are distracted by what's visible. What was visible in 1979 was dramatic. Gas lines, energy anxiety, the sense that the country was getting pushed around by forces it couldn't control. The Iranian Revolution hit global oil supply, and the second oil shock made fuel prices surge. You could literally sit in your car and watch your time evaporate in a line that wrapped around the block. That kind of pain feels like the story. It's tangible, it's cinematic, it's easy to remember, but gas lines are a symptom. The deeper story in the late 1970s was that America had fallen into stagflation, high inflation, mixed with weak growth, something the post-war system wasn't supposed to produce. For decades, the basic expectation was simple. The economy grows, wages rise, the next year is a little better. Inflation wasn't supposed to become a lifestyle. Yet by 1979, inflation wasn't just high, it was embedded. Prices kept rising not because one thing went wrong, but because the whole machine had developed a new rhythm, and it was starting to punish anyone who lived on paychecks instead of assets. Here's what made it so easy to miss. Most people assumed it would snap back. That wasn't naive. It was reasonable, based on their lived experience. Americans had watched the system absorb shocks before. The Great Depression was ancient memory. World War II had forged prosperity. And even the turbulence of the early 1970s still felt like something you could outgrow. Inflation felt like weather. Bad now, better later. Annoying, not destiny. And institutions still projected confidence. The dollar was still the dollar. The United States was still the United States. The idea that the underlying deal was to work hard, stay steady, and move up could quietly start failing without a dramatic national moment felt almost impossible. Because if that deal breaks, you would expect sirens. You'd expect a date everyone remembers. You'd expect it to look like a crisis. Instead, it looked like normal life with a higher bill. That's why 1979 barely registers in public memory. It didn't come with one obvious villain that everybody agreed on. It didn't come with one election that changed everything. It came with a slow realization among policymakers that inflation wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a credibility crisis. The kind that makes lenders stop trusting long-term promises. The kind that makes the cost of borrowing climb. The kind that forces decision-makers to choose between protecting prices and protecting jobs. Most Americans weren't thinking in those terms. They weren't staring at bond markets. They were staring at grocery receipts. They were negotiating raises, not studying monetary policy. And because the surface of life still held, it was natural to believe the country was dealing with a temporary fever, not watching a system get rewired. If you want to understand why that quiet rewiring matters, why it changed the rules for wages, borrowing, housing, and even the idea of stability, then you need to subscribe. This channel is about the shifts most people only recognize decades later when the consequences are already baked in. Here's the unsettling part. The most dangerous changes always feel dangerous when they start. Sometimes they feel like responsible decisions. Sometimes they feel like common sense. Sometimes they feel like the adults in the room finally taking control. And sometimes, while everyone is focused on the loud crisis, they can see oil, gas lines, headlines. The real change is happening somewhere less visible, where the rules of the game are set. So if 1979 wasn't the year everything fell apart, what if it was the year the system quietly chose who would carry the risk from that point forward? After World War II, the American middle class did not emerge by accident. It was built inside a very specific economic order that existed for a relatively short period of time. That order shaped expectations so deeply that many people later assumed it was permanent. In reality, it was the product of incentives, institutions, and global conditions that lined up in America's favor in a way that had never happened before and would not last forever. In the decades following the war, the United States was industrially dominant in a way that is difficult to overstate today. Much of Europe and Asia had been physically destroyed. Factories were bombed out, infrastructure was shattered, skilled labor pools were disrupted. Meanwhile, American factories were intact, expanded, and already operating at scale. The United States produced cars, steel, appliances, machinery, chemicals, and consumer goods for both domestic use and global reconstruction. This meant American companies were not just competing locally, they were supplying the world. Manufacturing jobs sat at the center of this system. They were not glamorous, but they functioned as a reliable wage ladder. A high school graduate could walk into a factory, learn a skill, and expect steady pay increases over time. Productivity gains translated directly into higher wages because firms needed to retain workers and because competition was limited. When output rose, paychecks rose with it. For a large portion of the workforce, wages and productivity moved together. That alignment mattered more than people realized at the time. Unions played a significant role in locking that relationship into place. Collective bargaining did not just raise wages, it standardized expectations. Contracts tied pay increases to productivity and inflation. Benefits were negotiated alongside wages. Health insurance, paid time off, and retirement plans became normal features of employment rather than special perks. This did not happen because companies were generous. It happened because the economic environment gave workers leverage and unions institutionalized that leverage. The structure of household life followed from those arrangements. A single income could often support a family, not because people were frugal or morally superior, but because wages were sufficient relative to local costs. Housing prices were anchored to local incomes. A factory town paid factory wages, and homes were priced accordingly. Mortgage debt existed, but it was limited in size and duration. Homes are places to live, not speculative assets. The idea that housing would permanently outpace wages had not yet taken hold. Retirement followed a similar logic. Defined benefit pensions shifted risk away from individuals and onto institutions. Employers pooled risk across thousands of workers. Retirement income was predictable. It was not tied to daily market movements or individual investment decisions. People did not need to become amateur portfolio managers just to age with dignity. Combined with Social Security, pensions created a floor that allowed people to plan their lives without constant financial anxiety. Cultural norms reinforced these structures. Saving was encouraged. Debt was treated cautiously. Credit existed, but it was not yet central to household survival. Financial stress certainly existed, but it was episodic rather than permanent. Most families expected stability to return after downturns because, historically, it usually did. What is important to understand is that none of this depended on unique American virtue. It depended on conditions and incentives. Industrial dominance reduced competition. Labor bargaining power remained strong. Capital controls limited the speed at which money could move across borders. Financial markets played a supporting role rather than a commanding one. Growth flowed through wages first, not assets. This is why expectations formed the way they did. People who came of age in this period internalized a particular economic logic. Work led to stability. Loyalty was rewarded. Risk was shared. Planning made sense because the rules stayed relatively consistent. When people later struggled, many assumed they had mismanaged something personally, rather than recognizing that the underlying system had changed. If you want to understand how those rules were constructed in the first place, and why they could disappear without being voted away, this is the kind of history we explore here. Subscribing simply means continuing to build that understanding piece by piece. The most important realization is also the most unsettling. Systems that feel natural are often the most fragile. The economic order that built the American middle class did not collapse because it failed at what it was designed to do. It dissolved because the incentives underneath it began to change. And those changes were already forming long before most people realized the ground was shifting at all. In most people's memory, 1979 is a blur of gas lines, shag carpet, and things were expensive. It doesn't feel like a turning point. But in the plumbing of the American economy, 1979 is the moment the rules of the game changed. Because the country decided that the number one threat was no longer recession, it was inflation. By the late 1970s, inflation was not just a statistic. It was a lived experience that made everyday life feel unreliable. Your paycheck arrived, and you could feel it shrinking before it even hit your wallet. Prices didn't just go up, they kept going up, and they did it in ways that felt random. Groceries, rent, car repairs, heating bills. You could do everything right and still feel like you were sliding backward. That kind of environment destroys something deeper than savings. It destroys trust. If money can't hold its value, planning becomes guesswork, and a modern economy cannot run on guesswork for very long. That's the context for Paul Volcker. In August 1979, President Jimmy Carter appointed Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve, and his assignment was brutally simple: restore credibility, not popularity, credibility. Because by then, markets and households were starting to believe inflation wasn't a temporary fever. They were starting to believe it was the new normal. And once that belief sets in, it becomes self-fulfilling. Workers demand bigger raises because they expect prices to rise. Businesses raise prices faster because they expect costs to rise. Lenders demand higher interest because they expect dollars to lose value. Inflation stops being an event and becomes a mindset. Here's the key idea. Most people never get told plainly. Interest rates are the price of money. When the price of money is cheap, borrowing feels easy. You can finance expansion, you can take risks, you can smooth out shocks. When the price of money is expensive, the entire economy starts behaving differently, because debt stops feeling like a harmless tool and starts feeling like a threat. Volcker's Fed chose to make money expensive on purpose. In October 1979, the Fed made a major shift in how it fought inflation, leaning harder into controlling the growth of money and credit. In practice, what the public felt was this: interest rates surged, borrowing costs spiked. Loans that used to make sense suddenly didn't. The economy didn't slow down in an abstract way. It hit a wall. Homebuyers felt it immediately because mortgage rates climbed into the teens. Businesses felt it because lines of credit tightened. Cities and states felt it because financing got pricier. And workers felt it because when money is expensive, hiring becomes cautious. This is where the incentive change starts. When inflation is the top enemy, the economy tolerates unemployment as collateral damage. That sounds cold, but it's the trade-off. Volcker believed, and many economists agreed, that inflation had to be broken even if it caused a recession, because high inflation eventually corrodes everything, including job creation, and the recessions that followed. In 1980, and again in the early 1980s, weren't a surprise side effect. They were part of the strategy. Demand had to cool. Wage growth had to slow. Pricing power had to be restrained. The system needed a reset. And here's where the change becomes structural, not just cyclical. When money becomes expensive, companies learn a new lesson. Flexibility beats loyalty. If financing is costly and demand is uncertain, the safest corporate posture is to keep labor and long-term commitments as adjustable as possible. That is, when you start to see the early erosion of the old assumption that a stable job is the center of a stable life. Not because executives held a meeting and announced, "We're ending the middle class," but because the incentive landscape changed. Higher rates reward cost control, they reward short payback periods, they punish long, slow investments, they make steady feel risky. At the same time, this period sits near the beginning of a wider shift people feel today without knowing when it started. The growing separation between what workers produce and what workers are paid. Productivity kept climbing over the long run, but wage growth stopped matching it the way it often did in earlier decades. That divergence didn't begin on one single day, and it wasn't caused by one decision alone. But 1979 is a hinge where the economy's priorities harden. Price stability becomes sacred. Labor bargaining power weakens in a world where unemployment is an accepted tool. Capital becomes more mobile, and the cost of capital becomes a central lever. If you want to understand why this shift happened, and how policy decisions quietly reshape daily life decades later, subscribe, because this is the part of economic history most people only recognize after the consequences arrive. The unsettling part is that Volcker did succeed at his primary mission. Inflation eventually came down. Credibility was restored. The question is, what else changed while the country was celebrating that victory, and why the win felt like relief for the system, but a slow squeeze for a lot of households who thought the old rules would return once the crisis passed. At first, nothing broke. That is the part people miss when they look back at the last 40 years and try to pinpoint the moment the middle class got thinner. The shift did not arrive like a crash. It arrived like a slow transfer, almost polite. Over time, the risks that used to be absorbed by large institutions and spread across a big, growing economy started landing directly on household. Not because anyone announced a new rule called risk goes to families now, but because incentives changed, and then everyone adapted to the new incentives. In the earlier post-war system, a lot of the scary parts of life were buffered. A stable job meant predictable hours, predictable pay, and usually predictable benefits. Pensions were a promise made by the employer, and the employer carried the investment risk. If markets did poorly, it was the pension fund's headache, not the workers. Healthcare was not cheap, but it was far less likely to wipe out a family's finances. Housing costs were not trivial, but they were connected to local wages in a way that made the math feel honest. If you worked full-time, you could plan. Not perfectly, but you could plan. That planning is what people really mean when they say middle class. It is not a number. It is the ability to make commitments without gambling your entire future. Then the long aftermath began. Wages did not collapse overnight, but over the decades, wage growth for typical workers stopped keeping pace with the costs that matter most: housing, healthcare, education, childcare, and insurance. Productivity kept rising, meaning the economy learned to produce more value per hour. But the link between that rising output and rising pay weakened. If you were a household trying to stay middle class in real terms, The solution was not one dramatic choice. It was a series of quiet adjustments. A second income, more overtime, less savings, a little more credit. And those adjustments worked until they became the new normal. The two-income household is the clearest example. People often frame it as cultural change, and of course culture matters, but the economic logic was simple. If the cost of the essentials rises faster than one paycheck, a second paycheck becomes less of a lifestyle upgrade and more of a stabilizer. It helps, but it also changes the stakes of everyday life. If one person loses a job in a one-income household, it is a crisis. If one person loses a job in a two-income household that relies on both incomes just to cover the fixed costs, it is still a crisis. The difference is that now, there is less slack. The household is running hotter. More of life is on a tighter margin. As the margin got tighter, consumer debt stepped in as a bridge. Credit cards, auto loans, home equity lines, and later the normalization of rolling balances were not simply personal irresponsibility. For many families, debt became a way to smooth a budget that no longer matched the calendar. You could keep the lifestyle looking stable while the underlying economics got more fragile. And because the system still produced growth, it was easy to believe the fragility was temporary. The paycheck would catch up, the promotion would come, the next year would be easier. That belief is powerful, and it kept people moving forward even as the floor under the middle class quietly thinned. Housing then shifted from being primarily shelter to being a financial engine. When wages are not rising fast enough, the easiest way for households to feel wealthier is through asset appreciation, especially the house. That works when home values rise. It feels like progress. But it also changes the economy's center of gravity. More attention goes to interest rates, mortgages, refinancing, and what your house is worth instead of what your labor's worth. A wage-driven middle class becomes an asset-driven middle class, and that sounds fine until you realize what it implies. Asset-driven systems reward the people who already have assets, and they punish the people who are trying to get in later. Stability starts depending on market conditions you cannot control. Retirement is where this risk transfer becomes impossible to ignore. The decline of defined benefit pensions and the rise of 401k-style plans did not just change paperwork. It moved the responsibility for retirement from institutions to individuals. Instead of a formula and a promise, retirement became an account balance exposed to market volatility. That is not automatically bad, but it changes the emotional reality of aging. A market downturn is no longer an abstract headline. It is your retirement date moving, your monthly withdrawal shrinking, your plan being rewritten in real time. The risk used to sit on a corporate balance sheet. Now it sits in your kitchen. Meanwhile, healthcare and education costs rose in ways that behave like surprise bills built into the system. You can do everything right and still get hit. A medical event, a tuition bill, a specialist out of network, a child needing support. These are not moral failures. They are structural expenses that grew faster than paychecks, and they arrived precisely when households had less buffer than they used to. Here's the twist that makes this so hard to see in the moment. The economy did grow. Innovation happened. New industries expanded. Markets rose. For many people, life visibly improved in technology, convenience, and options. But growth and stability are not the same thing. An economy can expand while the typical household becomes more exposed to shocks. That exposure is what risk move downward means. It means the system can look healthy at the top, while everyday life becomes more dependent on perfect timing, steady employment, and markets behaving. And that leads to an uncomfortable question that sits right under the surface. If the middle class became more fragile because risk moved into households, then the real story is not only what happened in 19... The real story is why the new system kept pushing families to solve structural problems with personal adaptations. And what happens when those adaptations finally hit their limit. By the time you reach the present, it becomes clear that 1979 was not a moment that changed everything overnight. It was the moment the logic underneath everyday life quietly shifted. What followed was not collapse, but a slow reordering of how money worked, how risk was distributed, and what it meant to feel financially secure. Understanding that distinction is what makes the story useful rather than alarming. Before that shift, the American economy was largely wage-driven. Most households depended primarily on income from work, and the system around them was built to stabilize that income over time. Wages tended to rise alongside productivity. Housing prices generally reflected local paychecks. Retirement security came from pensions that pooled risk across institutions rather than placing it on individuals. Inflation mattered, but it moved slowly enough that people could plan around it. The system rewarded participation more than positioning. But after 1979, that balance gradually flipped. The economy did not stop growing, but the source of stability changed. Wealth accumulation became increasingly tied to assets rather than wages. Stocks, real estate, and financial instruments grew faster than paychecks. Those who owned assets early benefited from compounding gains. Those who relied mainly on income felt constant pressure to keep up. The economy became more dynamic and more productive in aggregate, but also more uneven in how security was experienced. This is why so many people feel like they did everything right and still ended up uncertain. It is not because they failed to adapt or made poor choices. It is because the rules around risk changed. Volatility that once sat with institutions slowly moved on to households. Retirement became dependent on market timing, healthcare costs rose faster than wages, education became an investment gamble rather than a guaranteed ladder. Debt filled the gaps where income no longer stretched far enough. None of this required a single villain or a grand plan. It emerged from incentives that rewarded flexibility, liquidity, and financial return over long-term stability. Inflation plays a different role in this world as well. For people living on fixed incomes or approaching retirement, rising prices feel more threatening because the old buffers are gone. When wages no longer anchor purchasing power and assets fluctuate with markets, inflation becomes harder to absorb. This is why debates about inflation feel so personal and so charged today. They are no longer abstract policy discussions. They touch the core of household security. What this perspective helps clarify is that there is no simple way to go back. The post-war system existed under specific conditions that no longer apply. Global competition is permanent. Capital moves instantly. Demographics have shifted. Technology has reshaped labor. Wanting the outcomes of the old system without recognizing the conditions that created it only leads to frustration. The more useful approach is understanding how the current system actually works and making decisions with that reality in mind. That does not mean resignation. It means orientation. When you understand that the economy is now asset-driven, you can think more clearly about savings, risk, and timing. When you recognize that volatility is structural, not accidental, you can focus on resilience instead of chasing certainty. When you stop framing financial stress as a personal failure, you regain agency. History becomes a tool rather than a source of regret. For many people watching, especially those who lived through these decades, this reframing can be relieving. It explains why expectations formed in one era no longer match outcomes in another. It separates memory from myth. It allows you to see your own financial story as part of a broader system rather than a series of isolated decisions. That is ultimately what 1979 still explains about life today. Not that something was stolen in a single year, but that the ground beneath the economy shifted quietly, and most people were never told what changed. Once you see that shift clearly, modern financial life becomes less confusing and more navigable. If this way of looking at economic history helps things click, that is exactly what American Wealth Archive is here for. Not panic, not predictions, but clarity. Understanding how incentives shape outcomes and how past decisions echo into the present makes it easier to think clearly about what comes next. If you want more of that perspective, subscribing is a natural next step.